These are 5 physical choke points, plus 2 digital ones, that the entire modern economy depends on. And every one of them is narrow enough, fragile enough, or concentrated enough to fail. This video covers what they are, how close they have already come to failing, and why a handful of single points of failure still manage to hold civilization together. We tend to picture the global economy as something enormous and resilient, far too big to break. The reality runs the opposite direction. The oil that fuels it, the goods that stock its shelves, the data that runs its banks, and the chips inside nearly every device all get funneled through a small number of thin lines on the map. A few are stretches of water you could see straight across. Others are cables thinner than a garden hose, lying in the dark on the seabed. One is a single island. Squeeze any of them, and the whole system feels the pressure right away. Let us walk through all 7, starting with the most concentrated energy corridor anywhere on Earth. The Strait of Hormuz ranks as the single most important oil transit choke point in the world. It threads between the southern coast of Iran and the Mazandaran Peninsula of Oman, linking the Persian Gulf to the open ocean. At its tightest point, the strait measures just 21 nautical miles across, and the shipping lanes themselves are far narrower than that. Under a traffic separation scheme first adopted back in 1973, traffic moves through 2 lanes, roughly 2 nautical miles wide, divided by a 2 nautical mile buffer. That leaves about 6 nautical miles of usable corridor carrying 1/5 of the world's oil. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, roughly 20 million barrels of oil per day crossed Hormuz in 2024, which works out to around 20% of global petroleum liquids consumption and close to 27% of all seaborne oil trade. The strait also carries about 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas trade, a flow dominated by Qatar. Asia is the destination for almost all of it, and in 2024, 84% of the crude leaving the strait was bound there, with China, India, Japan, and South Korea alone accounting for 69%. Pipelines do exist that can route oil around the strait. Saudi Arabia operates an east-west pipeline. The UAE runs a line out to Fujairah on the open coast. And Iran built the Gore-Jask pipeline, inaugurated in 2021. Add all that spare capacity together, though, and the EIA puts the total somewhere between 2.6 and 3.5 million barrels a day. That leaves well over 14 million barrels a day with nowhere else to go. Conflict has shadowed this strait for decades. The Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s brought the so-called Tanker War, and in April 1988, the U.S. Navy fought Operation Praying Mantis here, its largest surface action since the Second World War. 4 tankers were attacked off Fujairah with limpet mines in May 2019, an attack attributed to Iran. The following month, 2 more tankers, the Front Altair and the Kokuka Courageous, were struck in the Gulf of Oman. A U.S. Navy commander assessed that the damage to the Kokuka Courageous was not consistent with an external flying object hitting the ship and bore a striking resemblance to known Iranian limpet mines. Weeks later, Iran's Revolutionary Guard fast-roped from a helicopter to seize the British-flagged Stena Impero. The most serious crisis arrived in June 2025. Israel struck Iranian nuclear sites on June 13th. The United States followed with strikes on Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan on June 21st and June 22nd, and that is when Iran's parliament voted in favor of closing the Strait of Hormuz. Esmail Kosari, a Revolutionary Guard commander and member of parliament, laid out the position this way. The Parliament has reached the conclusion that the Strait of Hormuz should be closed, but the final decision in this regard lies with the Supreme National Security Council. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio called the move economic suicide and pressed China to lean on Tehran. Markets responded inside hours. Brent crude climbed as much as 10%, then pushed above $81 a barrel on June 23rd, before sliding back roughly 2.77% the next day, once Iran's retaliation on a U.S. airbase in Qatar caused no casualties. Goldman Sachs estimated a $12 geopolitical risk premium and modeled that Brent could briefly spike to around $110 under a serious disruption scenario. The strait, in the end, was never physically closed. That is the recurring pattern with Hormuz, where the threat stays constant. The leverage is enormous, but the actual closure never comes. As one energy analyst put it, no other major sources of supply can replace what comes out of the Gulf, especially since around 70% of OPEC plus spare production capacity sits in the Gulf itself. Shutting Hormuz would wound Iran as badly as anyone else. The danger here is not that the threat is hollow, but that a single miscalculation could turn it real. If Hormuz is the most concentrated choke point, the Strait of Malacca is the busiest. Running between the Malay Peninsula and the Indonesian island of Sumatra, it stitches together the Indian and Pacific Oceans. A record 94,301 ships transited the strait in 2024, a figure up 5.5% from the year before. At the Phillips Channel in the Singapore Strait, the navigable width pinches down to somewhere between 1.5 and 1.96 nautical miles. The cargo numbers are hard to absorb. Around 23.7 million barrels of oil per day moved through Malacca in 2023, briefly more than Hormuz handled that same year. And roughly a quarter of every traded good on the planet passes through this one channel. The Institute for Supply Management put it plainly in 2023. The volume of trade that transits through this strait is staggering. $3.5 trillion of global trade navigates through its waters annually. For one country, that dependence is a genuine strategic wound. Roughly 80% of China's crude oil imports and about 60% of its total oil supply travel through Malacca. Back in 2003, Chinese President Hu Jintao gave the vulnerability a name, the Malacca Dilemma, and the worry behind it was simple. In a conflict, a rival navy could choke off China's energy supply at this single, narrow point. Beijing has poured staggering sums into engineering an escape from that dilemma. China built an oil and gas pipeline straight across Myanmar, from the Bay of Bengal into Yunnan province, funded the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and developed the port of Gwadar. The U.S. Government Accountability Office found that between 2013 and 2021, China provided $679 billion for infrastructure projects abroad, and the Griffith Asia Institute estimated cumulative belt and road engagement reached $1.175 trillion since 2013. Here is the thing, though. The share of Chinese energy imports still routed through Malacca has barely shifted, estimated at 75 to 80% across 2024 and 2025. You can spend more than $1 trillion and still fail to escape a channel 2 miles wide. Malacca carries an older threat as well, and that threat is piracy. The year 2024 brought 107 piracy incidents across Asia, up 6% year over year, with attacks on tankers climbing. In one case, in March 2024, armed thieves boarded a bulk carrier off Singapore and siphoned $400,000 worth of marine fuel oil during a 3-hour overnight operation. Joint patrols by Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines have kept the problem contained. But contained is a long way from solved. Of all the choke points, the Suez Canal is the one ordinary consumers genuinely noticed, because in March 2021, they watched a single ship shut it down. Start with the canal itself. It opened on November 17, 1869, after a decade of construction led by the Frenchman Ferdinand de Lesseps. Stretching 193 kilometers from Port Said on the Mediterranean to the city of Suez on the Red Sea, it shaves roughly 8,900 kilometers off the voyage between the Arabian Sea and London. The canal's history is knotted up with empire. Britain bought a major stake in 1875, and in July 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the waterway, a move that triggered the Suez Crisis, an invasion by Britain, France, and Israel, and a withdrawal forced by U.S. financial pressure. The canal sat closed entirely from 1967 to 1975 after the Six-Day War. Egypt completed a major expansion in 2015, adding a 35-kilometer parallel channel so traffic could finally run both ways. Before 2023, roughly 12% of all global trade passed through Suez. Then came the Ever Given. On March 23, 2021, the Ever Given ran aground in the canal during high winds and a sandstorm. The ship measured 400 meters long, operated by the Taiwanese company Evergreen Marine, owned by a Japanese firm, and technically managed by a German one. It wedged itself diagonally across the channel and stopped traffic dead. The Dutch firm SMIT Salvage, a subsidiary of Boskalis, took on the job, and freeing the vessel required 14 tugboats and days of dredging before it finally came loose on March 29, 2021. The cost depends entirely on how you measure it. Lloyd's List estimated $9.6 billion a day in delayed goods, which works out to roughly $400 million an hour. The Suez Canal Authority pegged its own lost transit fees closer to $15 million a day. More than 422 ships ended up stacked in the queue, and 27 of them gave up waiting altogether and rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope, a detour that added a week to 10 days. The backlog did not clear until April 3, 2021. The Ever Given was a 6-day accident, but what followed was a crisis that has dragged on for years. Starting in late 2023, attacks on shipping in the nearby Red Sea, which we will come to shortly, drove traffic away from Suez on a massive scale. The Suez Canal Authority reported that just 13,213 ships transited in 2024, down from more than 26,000 the year before, a collapse of 50%. Canal revenue dropped roughly 60%. In the fourth quarter of 2024 alone, revenue came to $880.9 million, down from $2.4 billion. Container traffic specifically fell by around 90%, and the World Bank found that maritime trade through the corridor had dropped by roughly 75% by the end of 2024. Egypt's prime minister estimated losses running as high as $550 million a month. A canal that took 10 years to build and that an empire fought a war to control was emptied out, not by closing it, but by making the water around it too dangerous to reach. The fourth choke point proves that a thin line does not need an enemy to fail. Sometimes the weather alone is enough. The Panama Canal opened on August 15, 1914, built by the United States after an earlier French attempt led once again by Ferdinand de Lesseps collapsed in 1889. It cuts about 50 miles across the isthmus, and it does not work like a simple ditch. The whole system depends on Gatun Lake, an artificial lake created by damming a river to lift ships up and lower them back down through its locks. A 2016 expansion added a new set of larger locks built for the bigger Neo-Panamax vessels. The canal's ownership history is a saga in its own right. The United States held the surrounding canal zone in perpetuity until the Torrijos-Carter Treaties of 1977, signed by President Jimmy Carter and Panama's Omar Torrijos, set a handover date. On the final day of 1999, the United States completed the transfer to the Panama Canal Authority. Around 14,000 ships now transit every year, carrying something close to 5 to 6% of global maritime trade, and the United States is far and away the biggest user, with about 71% of the traffic originating from or bound for American ports. Then the lake ran low. Because the canal lives or dies on fresh water, drought is an existential threat, and drought is exactly what arrived in 2023 and 2024. On January 1, 2024, Gatun Lake sat at its lowest January level since records began in 1965, nearly 6 feet below the previous year. The canal normally runs 36 to 38 ship slots a day, and the Panama Canal Authority began cutting them hard, down to 25 in early November 2023, then 24, then 22 in December 2023, then 20 in January 2024, and from February 1st, just 18 slots a day. That amounted to more than a 50% reduction, and the authority also limited how deeply and therefore how heavily ships could be loaded. The rains eventually returned. By August 2024, the canal had restored bookings to 35 a day, and in July 2025, the canal's administrator, Ricarte Vasquez Morales, confirmed it directly. The Panama Canal is operating at full water capacity. A new reservoir on the Rio Indio won approval to build a buffer against future droughts. As the water crisis eased, a political one cracked open. In his January 2025 inaugural address, U.S. President Donald Trump declared, "China is operating the Panama Canal, and we didn't give it to China. We gave it to Panama, and we're taking it back." Military force, he suggested, was on the table. Secretary of State Marco Rubio traveled to Panama in February, and days later, Panama announced it would not renew its Belt and Road Initiative agreement with China, becoming the first Latin American country to walk away from it. Panama's answer to the wider pressure stayed consistent. President José Raúl Mulino insisted the canal is and will continue to be Panama's, and China's foreign ministry stated flatly that China does not participate in the management or operation of the canal. The fifth waterway shows what happens when someone deliberately turns a choke point into a weapon. Bab-el-Mandeb, whose name means Gate of Tears, is the strait at the southern end of the Red Sea, sitting between Yemen on one side and Djibouti and Eritrea on the other. It runs about 32 kilometers wide at its narrowest, split by Perim Island, and most commercial traffic squeezes through the Western Channel. Think of it as the front door to the Suez Canal, because that connection is the entire story. Before 2023, around 12% of global trade passed through here, and according to UNCTAD, 22% of global seaborne container trade transited the route in 2023. The crisis grew straight out of the war in Gaza after the October 7, 2023 Hamas attack on Israel. The Houthi movement in Yemen began striking shipping in the Red Sea. On October 19th, the destroyer USS Carney intercepted Houthi cruise missiles and drones in the first major engagement. A month later, on November 19th, 2023, Houthi fighters fast-roped from a helicopter onto a vehicle carrier called the Galaxy Leader and hijacked it. The ship carried a tangled international profile, Bahamian-flagged, Japanese-operated, British-owned, with links to an Israeli businessman. Its 25 crew members were taken hostage. They would not walk free until January 2025, more than a year later. The world's answer was Operation Prosperity Guardian, announced by U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin in December 2023, a coalition pulling in more than 20 countries. On the last day of that month, U.S. Navy helicopters killed 10 Houthi fighters trying to board a Maersk vessel, the first lethal exchange. The U.S. and U.K. followed in January 2024, with strikes on Houthi targets across Yemen. The effect on shipping was severe. Red Sea maritime traffic fell by around 70% between December 2023 and April 2024. Global freight rates climbed, and rerouting around the Cape of Good Hope added roughly $1 million to the cost of a single voyage. The Houthi spokesman framed the campaign as deliberate policy, declaring the group would target any ships heading to Israeli ports in any area we are able to reach. This is where the choke points start bleeding into one another. In February 2024, a bulk carrier called the Ruby Mar was struck by a Houthi missile and abandoned, and as it drifted, its dragging anchor severed 4 undersea internet cables on the Red Sea floor. One physical choke point had just taken down a piece of a digital one, which brings us to the 6th thin line, the one almost nobody ever thinks about. Almost everything you do online crosses an ocean floor. Somewhere between 95 and 99% of all intercontinental data travels through submarine cables rather than satellites. As of 2026, roughly 1.48 million kilometers of these cables sit in service across more than 600 active and planned systems, and an estimated $10 trillion in financial transactions move through them every single day. Out in deep water, each cable runs about as thick as a garden hose, with the actual fibers inside as fine as a human hair. These cables break constantly. The International Cable Protection Committee estimates 150 to 200 faults a year, the large majority caused by accidents, fishing nets, and dragging anchors. Each repair costs between $1 and $3 million and can stretch on for weeks or months. The fleet that handles that work is alarmingly thin. Testifying to a U.S. House committee in November 2025, a researcher from Telegeography put the total number of cable repair vessels worldwide at around 62, and a 2025 study warned that roughly 2/3 of those ships will reach the end of their service life by 2040, leaving the world facing a $3 billion bill just to stay connected. The industry is strikingly concentrated as well. 4 manufacturers, Alcatel Submarine Networks of France, Subcom of the United States, NEC of Japan, and HMN Tech of China, account for the overwhelming majority of the market. France considered Alcatel Submarine Networks important enough that in December 2024, the government nationalized the company outright for €350 million, citing critical infrastructure security. The real shift, though, is that these cables are now being damaged on purpose. Consider the Baltic Sea. In October 2023, a Chinese-owned container ship called the Nu Polar Bear dragged its anchor across a gas pipeline and a data cable, and China later wrote it off as an accident. In November 2024, two cables were severed within about 24 hours, and a Chinese-flagged carrier, the Yipeng 3, found itself shadowed by Danish, Swedish, and German vessels. Lithuania's foreign minister answered with a line that stuck. "If I had a nickel for every time a Chinese ship was dragging its anchor on the bottom of the Baltic Sea in the vicinity of important cables, I would have 2 nickels, which isn't much, but it's weird that it happened twice." On Christmas Day 2024, more cables went down, and Finland boarded a Russian-linked oil tanker, the Eagle S, in its first such action since World War II. A NATO commander dismissed the idea that dragging an anchor for 66 miles could be accidental, calling it something you have to try really hard to achieve. Taiwan lives under the same pressure. In February 2023, 2 Chinese vessels cut both cables serving the Matsu Islands, leaving 13,000 residents offline for around 50 days. And those particular cables have been damaged 30 times since 2017. Early 2025 brought more incidents, and in February 2025, a Chinese crewed ship was detained after severing a cable to the Penghu Islands. Months later, that case produced the first criminal conviction of its kind, when a Taiwanese court sentenced the captain to 3 years. A cable lying on the seabed has no border guards. That, more and more, is exactly the point. The 7th and final thin line is not a place you can sail through at all. It is an island, a company, and a single machine. Nearly every advanced device on Earth, every phone, every server, every car's onboard computer depends on chips, and the manufacturing of the most advanced chips is concentrated to a degree with almost no precedent in industrial history. Taiwan accounts for more than 60% of global foundry revenue and more than 90% of the world's leading-edge logic chip capacity. A single company, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, known as TSMC, produces roughly 90% of the most cutting-edge logic chips. TSMC turned out nearly 12,000 products for 522 customers in 2024, a customer list that includes Apple, NVIDIA, AMD, and Qualcomm. There is even a term for Taiwan's position, the Silicon Shield, the idea that the island's sheer indispensability to the world economy works as a form of defense in itself. Governments have clearly registered the risk. A global chip shortage between 2020 and 2023 idled car factories around the world. And in response, the United States passed the CHIPS and Science Act in August 2022, allocating $52.7 billion to semiconductor research, manufacturing, and workforce, including $39 billion in direct manufacturing awards. The largest single beneficiary is TSMC's project in Arizona, where production began in April 2024 at an advanced node. In November 2024, the outgoing Biden administration finalized $6.6 billion in direct grants and around $5 billion in loans, locking the deal in place before the change of administration. TSMC's total Arizona commitment has since grown to $65 billion, with announced expansion plans reaching well beyond that. Moving the factories does not move the whole problem, because there is a choke point sitting upstream of the choke point. Building the most advanced chips requires a specific kind of machine, an extreme ultraviolet lithography system, and exactly one company anywhere in the world manufactures them. That company is ASML, based in Veldhoven in the Netherlands, and its share of that market is effectively 100%. That single bottleneck explains why export controls have hardened into a front line. Since 2019, under United States pressure, ASML has been blocked from shipping its most advanced machines to China, and the Dutch government has steadily tightened the licensing on the equipment it can export. A Dutch minister explained the reasoning, saying technological advances had given rise to increased security risks in what she called the current geopolitical context. The chip supply chain, then, is a choke point nested inside a choke point. The world's advanced logic depends on Taiwan. Taiwan's fabs depend on TSMC, and TSMC depends on one machine from one company in one Dutch town. Those are the 7 thin lines: Hormuz and Bab-el-Mandeb for energy, Malacca and Suez for trade, the Panama Canal joining the oceans, the undersea cables carrying the data, and the chips that everything else runs on. What binds them together is not simply that they are narrow. It is that we have already watched every one of them buckle under strain. A single ship blocked Suez for 6 days. Drought cut Panama's traffic in half. Houthi missiles emptied the Red Sea and severed cables on the seabed in the process. Iran's parliament voted to close Hormuz. Anchors have been dragged across the cables that carry the world's data, and one court has now called that exactly what it appears to be. The most advanced technology on Earth traces back to one island, one company, and one machine. None of these systems has failed completely. The threats get made and then dissolve. The droughts break. The cables get repaired. The chips keep arriving. The reason all of this is worth understanding is that the resilience we lean on is far thinner than it looks. Modern civilization is not held together by something vast and unbreakable. It rests on 5 stretches of water, a web of cables, and a single supply chain, a small handful of failure points that, most of the time, simply hold. The question this video set out to answer was how thin those lines really are, and the answer is this: thin enough that it is worth knowing their names.